Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's show, we're going to dive into a bit of a different topic than we normally cover, but I know you're going to love it. We all face many situations in our lives where we try to get other people to do certain things, think a certain way, change their behavior in a certain area. Comes up all the time in our lives as parents, with our kids, with our partners, even extended family members. Maybe you want to change the way your child's behaving at school, or you're trying to get your partner to get on the same page about how to feed the kids in the best way. These situations can lead to frustration on everybody's part, and we're left wondering, is there a better way to do this? Well, on today's show, we get to hear from someone who has written a brand new book about a better way to change someone's mind. Jonah Berger is here to tell us about his new book, Catalyst, and how the concepts in the book can help us be more effective with our kids and our families. Let me tell you a bit about him. Jonah is a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, an internationally best-selling author, and a world-renowned expert on change, word of mouth, social influence, consumer behavior, and how products, ideas, and behaviors catch on. He's published over 50 articles in top-tier academic journals, teaches Wharton's highest-rated online course, and popular accounts of his work often appear in places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review. Over 1 million copies of his books, Contagious, Invisible Influence, and The Catalyst, How to Change Anyone's Mind, are in print in over 35 countries around the world. He often does keynotes at major conferences, advises to many early-stage companies, and consults for organizations that you've all heard of, like Apple, Google, Nike, and more. Jonah is also a parent and has a brand new baby at home, which makes me extra grateful that he is taking the time to be on the show today. Welcome, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's dive in, and I want to start with what got you interested in and excited about writing about the concepts that you cover in Catalyst.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I came out with my first book all about word of mouth. It's called Contagious, Why Things Catch On. That was sort of 2013, and that book really changed my life to some degree. At heart, I'm an academic. I do lots of academic research. That was my first foray into more popular perspectives, and since then I've had a chance to work with a variety of organizations. Everyone from big Fortune 500 companies like the Googles and the Apples and the Nikes of the world to small startups and everyone in between. But what I noticed is that everyone that I worked with had the same problem, which is they all had something they wanted to change. If they were in the sales or marketing function, they wanted to change a customer or client's mind. Employees wanted to change their boss's mind. Parents wanted to change their children's mind. Couples, partners wanted to change their spouse's mind. Everyone had something they wanted to change. But interestingly, we all were seeming going about it the wrong way. We all sort of push and prod and persuade and try to get something to happen, and often it doesn't work. And so what I wondered is, well, could there be a better way? And I've spent the last decade studying the science of change, how it works, and interviewing a range of experts, and really appreciate your help in writing this book as well, to get a sense of why change is so hard, and could there be a better way to do it than the way we often approach it?
Mhm. Such an important thing, because really it gets to the heart of so much of our human experience, right? Knowing things that we want to do or that we want to get other people to do, but how do we actually make that happen? How do we get people to do those things? How do we get
Yeah,
ourselves to do those things? So I love
yeah,
this idea, the title of Catalyst. I first read that when you sent the first email to me saying this is the title of this book, I thought, man, that brings me back to my biochemistry days, this
it
idea of
does.
catalyst reactions, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about that term. What does it mean to be a catalyst? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so taking a step back for a second, what do we do when we try to change minds or try to change behavior? And I think we often do some version of what I'll call pushing, whether we're trying to change our child's behavior, whether we're trying to change our spouse's opinion, whether we're trying to change an extended family member's view or something along those lines. We think if we just provide a bit more information, if we ask one more time, we provide more facts and more figures and more reasons, more threats or more rewards, they'll come around. And it makes sense why we think that, right? If there's a chair in a room and we want to get that chair to move, pushing is often a great way to get it to move, right? If we push that chair in a particular direction, it often goes in that particular particular direction. But when it comes to people, there's one problem, which is that people aren't like chairs, right? We push chairs, they go in that direction. We compel them, we push them that way. But when we push people, they often don't just go along, they often push back. And so what I wondered is, could there be a different approach? And as you brought up, indeed there is, and it actually comes from chemistry. And so think back, as you mentioned, to sort of your biochemistry, your old chemistry days. Think back to, most of us took chemistry in high school. We might remember that change in chemistry takes even longer than change does in the social world, right? It often takes thousands, if not millions of years to, plant matter to change into oil, or, carbon to change into diamonds. It takes a lot of temperature and pressure. And so chemists and others who want change to happen in the chemical world often use a special set of substances to get change to happen faster and easier. These substances do everything from clean the contact lenses to the grime in our cars. They do even things like help turn petroleum into bike helmets. They're an amazing set of substances that have won multiple Nobel Prizes. But what's most interesting about these substances is the way they generate change. They don't add temperature or pressure. Usually in chemistry, think about a popcorn kernel. You have a kernel of popcorn sitting in front of you on the counter. It doesn't just turn into popcorn. You have to heat it or add pressure to it to get it to go. Usually that's what we do in chemistry, but these special substances don't need more temperature or more pressure. They actually find an alternate way to create change. What they do is they don't up the pressure, they don't up the temperature, they reduce the barriers to change. They allow the same amount of change to happen with less pressure or less pushing. And that's exactly what catalysts do, both in the social world and the chemical world. They don't push harder, they figure out what are those barriers preventing change and how can we mitigate them. And so that at the core is what this book is all about. Not how can we push people harder, not how can we give our kids one more reason or threaten them, oh, if you don't clean up, you're not going to get your dessert. But how can we figure out, well, what are those barriers that are preventing change and how can we mitigate them? Why hasn't that person changed already? And how, by understanding why they haven't, can I make change faster and often easier?
Yeah, and you talk about 5 specific ways that people can be a catalyst for change. I want to go with this idea of pushing a bit more, because I
Yeah.
know that every parent listening, probably any adult listening, can relate to this, right? We have this idea that if we just push, if we give more reasons, more explanations, more rewards and consequences, more of this external sort of force, that we can get kids to think about things in the way we want them to, or to do things the way we want them to. But often that does backfire. And anybody who is raising a preteen or a teen or even a toddler right now can attest to that, right? It's like the more we push, the more they push back, and the
Yeah.
more frustrated we all get. So
Yes.
what is the better way to think about that?
Yeah, so first let's unpack why that happens,
Yeah.
a little bit of the psychology of why that happens. And so, as you mentioned, there are 5 key barriers I talk about in the book. They actually together spell a word, which is reduce. So the R is reactance, the E is endowment, D is distance, U is uncertainty, and CE is corroborating evidence. Each of those are one of the key barriers that often prevent change. And what you're talking about right now is reactance. And the idea behind reactance is very simple. People like to feel, whether we're talking about kids as people, whether we're talking about spouses as people, whether you're talking about your boss as people, people like to feel like they're in the driver's seat of their lives. They like to feel like they have freedom and autonomy, and they've chosen things because they like those things, because those things are what they want to do.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, when we try to ask them to do something, or pressure them to do something, or try to persuade them to do something, it impinges on that belief to feel like they're in control of their destiny. So whether it's your child who doesn't want to clean up their room, or whether it's your spouse who doesn't want to clean the dishes, or whether it's your brother or sister-in-law who's not listening to the thing you suggested that they do, when you suggest something, it's coming from you, it's not coming from them, right? And so it makes it feel like they're no longer in control. A good way to think about it is people have, in a sense, an anti-persuasion radar. It's almost like an anti-missile defense system, or kind of a spidey sense that goes off when people are trying to persuade them. Think about, in your own life, when you get an email from a salesperson, or an ad comes on the television, you switch the channel, right? When someone tries to persuade us, whether avoid or ignore that message, right? Your kid might run to the other room yelling, or sort of pretend they don't hear you, or even worse, they sit there and they counter argue. They think about all the reasons why what you're suggesting is wrong. right? And so this often happens with spouses, let's say. So, your spouse says, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? You say, oh, let's go see a movie, right? And they're not just sitting there going, oh, that sounds like a great idea. They're thinking, well, it's nice outside. Why don't we do something outside? Or we already saw a movie last week. Or, they're thinking about all the reasons why what you suggested is wrong. And so that's really the challenge, right? When we push people, they don't just go along. And so what we have to do is figure out a way to allow for autonomy, a way to allow them to feel like they're free or they're in control of their choices. So let's take that spouse for a second, right? Rather than saying, hey, let's go to the movies, a simple suggestion people often use is to give people what are called guided choices. Not just one option, but a couple, right? So rather than saying, hey, we could go to the movies, say, hey, we go to the movies or we could have Chinese food. And what that subtly does is that shifts the role of the listener. Rather than sitting there thinking about all the reasons they don't like what you suggested, they're thinking about which of the two options you suggested is better for them, which one they prefer, which means they're much more likely to pick one of those at the end of the day. And so the same thing is true with kids, right? As you nicely mentioned, I'm a parent of a 2.5-year-old. He's a wonderful boy. He listens sometimes, but not all the time. And when you ask him, hey, put on your pants, he thinks about all the reasons why he doesn't want to put on his pants or what he'd prefer to do. But if instead you say, hey, which do you want to put on first, your pants or your shirt? Which shirt do you want to wear, this shirt or that shirt? What you're doing there is you're giving him some choice. You're not giving an infinite number of choices. It's guided choice. It's a small set of options that sort of shape that path to encourage people to go in a particular direction. So you're giving them choice, and so they feel like they have freedom and control, but not all the choice in the world.
Yeah, because all the choice in the world can be incredibly overwhelming for
Oh,
anyone,
yeah.
particularly for kids, right? So that idea of like putting some guideposts around that. But I think this is so critical because many of the parents listening have children who have some type of developmental, mental health challenge, behavioral type of issues. Some kids have a heightened sensitivity to feeling like an adult or somebody is trying to push or control them, right? I mean, all kids, I think, have that to some extent, but some kids really tend to hone in on that very quickly. And the second they feel like something's coming at them, somebody's trying to get them to do something or a certain way, they get on what I call that hamster wheel of negotiating and arguing, exactly what you said, like coming up with all the reasons why they're not going to or they shouldn't have to, even if fundamentally they don't have a problem with what they were asked to do in the first place, right?
If they came up with it, they would have been fine doing it, but it's because
exactly
you
right.
came up with it. Yeah.
So that idea of, instead of pushing, looking at how can we remove the obstacles to this? How can we provide some choices here so that they still feel like they are coming up with the idea or having autonomy or say in the process? I think that alone can reduce such a significant percentage of the frustration that comes up between parents and kids throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was excited about talking to you today, and someone actually just yesterday emailed me another great example of the same. So I talk about sort of 4 solutions in the book. One is this sort of providing a menu or guided choices. Another one I talk a lot about is ask, don't tell. Right. So rather than tell people to do something, ask a question, because what it gets other people to do is gets them to commit to the conclusion. When they came up with the idea, you ask someone. In health communication, people often say, "Don't drink and drive, don't smoke, don't text and drive." If instead they said, "Hey, what are the consequences of smoking for your health?" People be much more involved themselves. And the same idea works with kids. They were sharing this great example of their kids spilt milk. Right. And usually as a parent, what you're going to do is, oh, why did you spill the milk? Oh, go clean it up. Oh, in which the kid gets defensive, right? Say, I don't want to clean it up. I don't want to do what you told me. But instead you can say, well, what should we do? Right? The milk spilled. What should we do? And first of all, the kid is sitting there going, oh, you're not yelling at me, right? Which is really nice. But also now I'm involved. Now I have to think about, well, what is the right thing to do with the milk? And again, you give them some guidance. You don't let them go in any direction. You don't ask any question at all. But what do we do when we spill milk, right? Asking the right question gets them to go, oh, well, we should clean it up. Right? Now, when they come up with that solution themselves, it's really hard then when you say, okay, well, what should we clean it up with? A paper towel. Okay, well, then help me go get a paper towel. It's much harder for them to say no because they came up with it, right? And this is true in a variety of contexts. I talk in the book about a boss who was trying to get their employees to work later, right? Work late on the weekends, all these things. Of course, people don't want to do that. So instead, he has a meeting. He says, what kind of company do you want to be? A good company or a great company? We all know how people answer that question. They say,
Yeah.
we want to be a great company. What do we need to do to be a great company? People brainstorm ideas. People say, oh, we probably need to work hard. And then he says, okay, well, now you came up with this idea. It's harder to back away from doing it later on. And so the asking rather than telling is a great way to allow people to participate, feel like they have some control, and make them more bought into the solution.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really practical strategy that parents can use as well. I'm thinking of, even examples with extended family members, partners, things like that, of
Oh, yeah.
buying, help having them come up with some of the ideas. And then, right, it's a lot harder to say no. I love that.
Yes.
You were talking about some examples from the book, and you touched on some health related things. And I think this particularly comes up as our children start to get older into those preteen and teen years. And we're trying to educate them and get them on board with making positive choices in their
Yeah.
life, that kind of stuff. You give some good examples in the book about how a lot of the well-intentioned things that companies or adults will say actually influence kids' behavior or people's behavior in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that we should be mindful of as parents that are not effective to do when it comes to wanting to get our kids on board with whether it's, avoiding illicit substance use or getting into inappropriate kinds of interactions with people online? What are some things that we might have a tendency to do that we should not do?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I tell the story in the book of the Tide Pod Challenge,
Yes.
which some of your listeners may remember,
Yeah.
right? And it's this thing where everyone remembers Tide Pods. These things go in the laundry. So you don't have to measure out your detergent. They're just a little pod you stick in. They're great. They're very effective. But a few years ago, there's a problem, which is people were eating them, and so teens were challenging each other online, eat Tide Pods. There were some funny videos about it, and so this thing kind of caught a little bit of fire online. And what did Tide do? They did what any company would do, right? They said, don't do it. They hired celebrities to tell people not to do it. And then, all hell broke loose, right? Rather than being less likely to do it, the exact opposite happened. Suddenly, interest in Tide Pod shot up online. Suddenly, visits to poison control went up as well. And the challenge is warnings often become recommendations, right?
Mhm.
Particularly for teens, particularly for people that are trying to separate themselves from their parents, or trying to define their own identity. Part of how we define that identity is to be different from other people, to be separate from our parents. I followed them for 10, maybe even 15 years. Now, part of the way I express my own identity is not doing what they say. By the way, this applies to teenagers. It also applies to spouses and bosses. It's the same idea, right? Everyone has this drive when someone tells them not to do something to push back. And so I think the first thing is, don't tell people not to do something. Right?
Mm.
Telling people not to do something often makes it more alluring. Whether that
Mhm.
person is someone to date, whether that person is eating a Tide Pod, suddenly someone will go, well, why are you telling me not to do this?
Mhm.
This thing must be interesting. Maybe I'll check it out. Maybe it's a way to get your attention. Maybe it's a way to define my own identity. And so definitely don't say, don't do this. I mean, I find often with our toddler, if he's not thinking about something, not talking about it is a great way to get him to ignore it. Now, if
Right.
you got a teenager, they're starting to think about these things. You can't completely ignore it. But again, asking questions can be kind of a great way to set up that discussion and to allow them to participate. Also even saying like, would you recommend this for someone else? So I
Mm.
talk about in the book the strategy called highlighting a gap, which is basically pointing out a gap between what people's attitudes are and their actions. So often, sometimes people do things themselves that they wouldn't recommend for others. There's a great video I talk about in the book in Thailand where they want to get people to quit smoking. So rather than telling them to quit smoking, they have kids walk up to them and say, hey, can I have a light? Now, obviously, if you're a smoker, you would not light a kid's cigarette. You'd tell that kid what a bad idea it is. All the smokers do that. They tell them why they shouldn't smoke. And at the end, the kid says, okay, well, why are you smoking? Right? And what that does is it says, hey, well, you're telling me not to do this. Why would you do it yourself? And so think about the same thing with your teenager saying, hey, would you recommend your friends use drugs? What would you recommend to your friend? Would you recommend that they did this particular thing? And if they wouldn't recommend it for a friend, that's kind of encouraging them to go, well, wait, maybe I shouldn't do it myself. And so again, rather than telling them, rather than pushing them, rather than telling them what not to do, forcing them one way, using questions and allowing them to come up with those ideas themselves, guiding that journey, leveraging cognitive dissonance, encouraging them to kind of come up with it themselves will make them much more likely to do what you want them to.
Yeah, and that really makes me think about the importance then of us as parents and adults in modeling the kinds
Yes.
of things that we
Oh,
want
yeah.
kids to do, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just talk about highlighting a gap, right? And I say this to parents all the time. It's like with kids, it cannot be do as I say, not as I do, because
Yes.
they are watching and picking up, even little ones are
Yes.
hearing and watching and noticing. And, whether it's trying to get them into healthier digital device habits, or
Yeah.
it's about substance use or eating their vegetables or whatever, they're going to default to the model that they see us providing. And so
Yes.
I'm thinking about that, highlighting the gap for ourselves too, of noticing maybe where we aren't in full integrity with what it is that we're trying to push our kids to do.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I unfortunately have some friends whose child has a substance abuse problem, and part of how they got that problem was seeing their parents use some of those substances at home. Their
Yeah.
parents don't have an abuse problem, but they've used it from time to time, and the kids saw that, and they sort of say, "Well, okay, if mom and dad are doing it, it must be okay." Same thing with digital devices, right? Certainly, it's really easy to say, "Well, I don't want my kids to be doing that," but if they see you doing that, or they see you peeking under the dinner table looking at your thing, or you're at soccer practice, but you're not paying attention, you're on your phone, well, why wouldn't they think then that that's okay for them to do as well? And so it's really hard sometimes because you say, well, hold on, I'm not my kid, I shouldn't have to do everything they do. They're 12, 14, 18, whatever it is, and I'm 45, I should be able to do what I want to do. That's fine. But then you have to say, well, if they're going to see you doing it, you have to be okay with them wanting to do it as well. Or maybe think about how can I do it in a way that they're less likely to see it, or it's kind of less invasive in their lives. Because I think, as you nicely said, if you're not living it yourself, it's hard to tell someone else to do it.
Absolutely. And this is where I think parents sometimes get into frustration with each other
Oh
in
yeah.
relation to the kids, right? When you have one, a mom and a dad,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever the situation is, two parents on somewhat different
Yes.
pages. And, I see this come up a lot in my work around, a parent who maybe wants to work on some health related changes for the child or the family, right?
Yeah.
Getting the child to eat healthier foods or not bring so much sugar in the house or things like that. And they're like, but my partner is eating ho-hos and Coke all the time.
Yeah.
And so there's this sense of, okay, I know I need to get my partner to,
Yeah.
buy into this. We need to provide a model for the child. But these are the real ways that this stuff shows up, right? And I think a lot of what you're talking about, and this is why I was so excited to share this book with people, because often the way that we go about trying to convince or push our partner to get on the same page with us in relation to the family, to our kids, really backfires. And then that makes everything worse.
Oh yeah, and I mean, we have this. I wouldn't say issue because issue is strong, but in our house, I'm not big on desserts. My wife is bigger on desserts. We want to raise our son to not be super keen on desserts, but we often have conversations about what's the best way to manage that. And so I certainly think it's not only you and the child; it's you and your spouse as well. One example I talk about in the book is sometimes when we ask for too much, right? This idea of distance, when we ask for people, completely don't eat any sweets. Well, that person's going to say no, right? That's very different from where they are already. And so you often kind of have to ask for less and then ask for more. Maybe say, hey, can you have them one night a week rather than 5 nights a week? Or, can you have them after our son or daughter goes to sleep rather than something else? Not asking for a huge change, but kind of breaking that big change. I talk about chunking the change, breaking that big change up into smaller chunks. I tell this story of a doctor who was trying to get a trucker to quit drinking soda. And the guy was drinking 3 liters of Mountain Dew a day, was hugely obese. The doctor in that situation wants to say, don't drink any soda. What's someone to say when you tell them not to drink any soda? Screw you, I'll do whatever I
Right.
want, right? So instead she said, well, okay, so you can still drink soda, just drink 2 liters rather than three,
Mhm.
fill the third one up with water. He grumbled, but after a month or so was able to do it, came back, she said, okay, now go from 2 to 1, grumbled, but was able to do that. Now go from 1 to 0. Eventually the guy lost over 25 pounds. It took a little longer, but it's much more realistic. When we ask for so much, there's a tendency to discount or ignore it, but by chunking that change up, it makes it more manageable and makes it more likely to happen.
Yeah, so important to think about with kids and adults, because the reality is, a lot of the time the pushback against change is about the change itself, the anxiety, the uncertainty
Yeah.
that brings up. And the bigger the jump that feels like, the scarier it feels. And the more we go,
Yeah.
nope, I'm going to stay right over here.
Yeah.
Thanks. And so I love that idea of approaching it in chunks, in pieces. And if you're struggling to get your partner on the same page or your child on the same page, to find maybe even a small entry point that you can have some agreement
Yeah.
on. And it might be a slower process, but it's still going to be quicker in the long run than staying at a stalemate and not having any forward progress.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, such practical, great tips. I really hope that this has encouraged people to want to check your work out more, because it really is just a fantastic book that has so many applications to
Well, thank
our
you.
relationships, our home lives, our work lives. Make sure to tell everybody, where can they get the book? Where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, sure. So the book is available wherever books are sold. So Amazon, Audible, Barnes and Noble, wherever you get your books. You can find me at Jonah. It's just Jonah Berger Berger.com. I'm at J1Berger on Twitter and on LinkedIn and other social platforms as well.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
and
we'll
sorry,
have,
I should mention, if folks are interested, there are also some resources on my website. So free workbooks and one pagers, just sort of, if you're not sure about the book yet or want to learn a little more, some tools that you can download before you go for the whole book.
yeah, and also those complement the book nicely. I was looking at those and give people even just some takeaway points, some easy things to have to implement
Yeah.
that. So just really want to encourage everybody to check out the book Catalyst. It's a fantastic resource. Check out Jonah's website and resources. We'll have all those links in the show notes. Jonah, can't thank you enough for being here with us today. Such a great conversation, and thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you next time for our next episode of the Better Behavior Show.